Well, time for another episode. Aren't you lucky? Anyway, I'm following up yesterday's AEW thing because after I had posted what I posted, a lot more shit came out. It seems that while Tony Khan was still having a press conference, Punk went to the back after cursing out almost the entire locker room, and the Young Bucks, Mike and Nick Jackson and Kenny Omega, walked up to him. It's not 100% clear who threw the first punch, but it looks like Punk did it. He punched out Mike Jackson. His buddy Ace Steel threw a chair at Nick Jackson, hit him in the eye with it, and then he bit Kenny Omega. Now, as for tonight, from what I understand, it was on Pro Wrestling Between the Sheets. Omega, Punk, and the Bucks are off TV tonight. I've never been really thrilled with the Bucks. I mean, I know they were the darling of the Indies and Ring of Honor and stuff like that, but they're just another, high spot artist team. That's all they are. Omega is a great worker, and the reason I say that was he was brought into Jersey All Pro Wrestling when I was still, involved in this whole thing. And he actually, I'm trying to remember, I think they did put the belt on him. I'm not 100% sure. But at one point, Jersey All Pro was drawing roughly 1,800 to 2,000 fans in the Rollway Rec Center. And Kenny Omega and Danny D'Amato put on a classic that had everybody on their feet. It was a 5-star match. And the promoter, Fat Frank, ran into the ring and raised both their hands. Great stuff. Kenny was always a good worker. I don't know, there's a lot of shit aimed at him now for whatever reason. Seems that he spent most of his, time rather in Japan after doing the Indies and stuff like that. I don't want to stay on this subject because I got other things going on here, but this whole thing is a joke because basically right about now Tony Khan is making Eric Bischoff look good. The other thing is this whole bunch of shit with these interim championships. You had an interim world championship. Now you have an interim women's world championship. Dude, if someone can't defend the fucking belt, it's vacated. That's Pro Wrestling 101. You're supposed to be a fan of this shit. The belt is baked. If somebody gets hurt, leaves, whatever, they don't have an interim champion till your little buddy can get well and come back. They usually had a tournament to crown a new champion. That's what happened. None of this bullshit, hold the belt until somebody's well enough to claim it again. This is bullshit. I mean, obviously Punk ain't all he's cracked up to be, and I'm not sure about Thunder Rosa. She got hurt, but I also heard some bullshit about her working stiff with people. So, again, I don't know why this shit's going on. This guy basically has taken what could have been a good thing and just being a mark worse than Eric Bischoff ever was. So that's the AEW side of it. I was asked about Avon theaters and Avon films and what I know about them. Well, let me take a sip of water here. I've been sweating my ass off all morning. I think it was around 1982. I was waiting to meet somebody on the Deuce who never showed up. And I believe the theater was the Avon 42nd. And they were running Taming of Rebecca and something else. Something about the poster intrigued me because Sharon Mitchell was on it, and I like Sharon. So I went in and saw something that was pretty fucking bizarre and pretty fucked up, and I can't go into graphic detail here because I'll get kicked off of YouTube. But that was the first Avon film I actually saw in the theater, and it's one of the most notorious Avon films because there was something about a serial killer or a murder was captured, and in his VCR was a tape of Taming of Rebecca queued up to a certain scene. I'm not going to go into detail what that scene was, but let's just say the film was appalling. Now, going back to the Avon dynasty, there's a lot of false information floating around out there, and you can check any of this shit out. The Rialto Report did something on it, which I checked out to clarify some things. David Naylor from Alpha Blue Archives had Avon Dynasty box sets coming out, and he hired someone to write about Avon, and it was, again, Bill Landis, and again, everything he wrote was complete fucking bullshit. Shelley Wilson was not Avon. Avon was started by a guy named Murray Offen. Murray had been busted back in the 50s because they were still doing that dime dance thing, these little dance hall things that were fronts for prostitution. It was a bust. His name was splattered all over, the newspapers. So Murray decided to be one of the shadow guys. And in being the shadow guys, he invested in a lot of unrentable properties around Times Square, especially some theaters. He took the Hudson Theater and changed it to the Avon Hudson. The Doll Theater was his. The Avon 42nd. There was a bunch of little Avon theaters, maybe around 6 of them, I think. Also, the peep shows and stuff like that. Anyway, it was Murray, not Shelley Wilson. Shelley Wilson owned the Venus, the Pix, and a couple other things. She was always looking to expand her holdings, but like I said before, most of the people in the business considered her a pain in the ass. So what happened was Murray started talking to the theater operators about what scenes in porn films sort of tweaked the audience. And it was, rape, abduction, hardcore S&M, torture, whatever. So Murray decided to make films strictly for that audience, and those were the Avon films. And he hired certain directors who had sort of a pedigree in that type of thing. One of them who I knew personally was Carter Stevens. And Carter had told me that basically, one of my favorite porn films was Wicked Schoolgirls that he did. And he told me that basically he was contracted by Murray to shoot 3 films, and each film had to have an S&M scene put in it that could be removed when the film was shipped out of state to, the hillbilly states or whatever. So I think Carter said he was paid, I think $5,000 a film or something like that. Another director was Joe Davian, who did a bunch of shit with Vanessa Del Rio and Sharon Mitchell, Appointment with an Agony, some Women in Prisons films. He sort of a fly on the wall stuff, but his stuff was pretty bizarre and grim. And unfortunately, I think, and Carter Stevens verified this, that Joe fucked around with these guys and was stealing prints, and he disappeared. Now, some people thought he left the country, but Carter sort of confirmed that he may now be residing in a 55-gallon drum somewhere in the landfill. The other director was Sean Costello, who was another B&D and S&M aficionado. So they cranked out a bunch of these films. The crown jewel in the creepy Avon crown would be Phil Prince, because Phil was a live sex show performer and was married to a Puerto Rican girl named Teresita, and they were a couple that did live sex shows. Phil always wanted to move up in the hierarchy, but what happened was Teresita was killed in a rampage murder. She was visiting her friend who was a coke dealer. A rival dealer showed up, and there was a problem, and basically both of them were slaughtered. That writer, again, sort of attributed it. They thought it was Phil. It wasn't Phil. Phil was devastated by the whole thing. And basically, he was kept under wraps. But he had told Murray that he thought he could do a better job directing for less than what other directors were getting paid. So they gave him a shot, and he basically cranked out some of the more twisted and sadistic Avon films. Taming of Rebecca, Story of Prunella, things like that. Some guy up in Maine, and they said it was a biker named Billy, but it wasn't a biker named Billy. It was a guy named Billy who had a bunch of sex-oriented businesses up in Maine. What I didn't know at the time, I guess Maine in the 70s was really Wild West, even more worse than New York. Brothels, strip clubs, porn joints. So Billy came down with these girls, I think it was Velvet Summers, Ambrosia Fox, Sherry Sinclair maybe, and Nico. And they all did these films. And these films were pretty much based on basically rape, S&M, abduction, torture, bondage and discipline, whatever, explosions of bodily fluids, performers like Ron Jeremy, Annie Sprinkle, again, Vanessa Del Rio, and these other Avon chicks that were brought down there, and George Payne, who was basically a speed freak back then. Payne was probably one of the weirdest and most sadistic performers because he looked a lot older than he was. And he did some really creepy shit. And, these were the films that Reagan's Mies Commission held up as the most vile and violent examples of mob-produced pornography. Well, they sort of were. The whole thing was that the bullshit story fed out was that Phil Prince and his partner were robbing a Haagen-Dazs and shot the clerk. And there was some kind of Keystone comedy chase with the cops. They got caught. They got locked up. His buddy died in jail. Phil got out, but then murdered an associate in front of the Bryan Theater and was serving life in prison. This according to you-know-who. Phil did an interview before he passed away, right after the interview, and was amazed at the bullshit that was put out by this party. What happened was he got out of jail, he moved back to New England, was driving a truck and got in an accident which put him in a fucking wheelchair. He didn't murder anybody. The whole Haagen-Dazs thing was that they were dealing drugs and somebody didn't pay and there was an argument and somebody got shot. Again, this was all embellished and, like I said, Alpha Blue Archives had this thing, the story of Avon Films, which this guy wrote, and it was all bullshit, complete lies. You want to go into the Avon thing, like I said, the Rialto Report has the whole story, has the interview with Phil. Phil was sort of baffled about this guy writing all this bullshit about him, but then a lot of other people were baffled about this guy writing bullshit about them, too. This is a clearer cut story about what happened. Murray's daughter actually got involved in the whole deal, but not in a sexual way. I think she did an interview for I think it was Pain Mania or something like that. But unfortunately, she got caught up in the drug shit that was going on and died from an overdose. Pretty much everything folded up. Murray gave it up, whatever. I mean, everything was folded up to be, toward the end of the 80s anyway, with, the AIDS and the crack and everything like that. I ran into his nephew, Michael, on Facebook, who asked me if I had ever heard of him. They called him Murray the Jew. And I'm like, yeah, he keeps popping up now and then. Michael now lives in South America. He was involved in something. He was running some kind of store close in the Times Square area. So, yeah, the Avon films are basically, a lot have been put out by After Hours Cinema, the company that puts out my stuff. Carter's stuff is out. Phil's stuff is out. Story of Prunella is out. Taming of Rebecca's out. These are not for the faint-hearted. They really push the envelope, and some of them are vile and repulsive. But the whole thing was, you had the 70s, like I said, Deep Throat in 72, then you had a whole bunch of films up into the 80s. But, these were straight, fuck films, for lack of better words. People wanted something more different, and Avon gave it to them. But unfortunately, they attracted a lot of attention from the law and orders forces, and like I said, the Mies Commission. And, they were held up. So, luckily, they're still available, or luckily or unluckily, depending on your point of view, because it's an important little slice of New York City history and probably the last New York City produced stuff that actually ran in the grindhouses over there. No one was invited to the AVN awards from these companies because they were the outlaw companies and people were actually afraid of the people who did them. But it was a dark and violent period in the history of adult films, and these things survived the purge and, like I said, are still around. And, unfortunately the theaters aren't. The Doll had a live sex show plus, ran the films. Avon Hudson, Avon 42nd, all these other things. There was an Avon 7 somewhere too. They were all around and they exclusively got them. Not that they weren't footballed over to other theaters. And I had an argument. I thought Forced Entry was an Avon film, but it wasn't. It was, shot by Sean Costello. And it was actually distributed by Chelly Wilson's arm of the porn business, Variety Films. So Sean argued it wasn't an Avon film, and he was right. So I was wrong there. I will admit when I get wrong information. So that's sort of a brief history of what went on. Like I said, a lot of the X-rated stuff, I really can't get into graphic detail here on YouTube, but I cover it in the magazine. A lot of it's in my books, so you can pick it up there. So that's our show for today. Wow, 3 days, 3 shows. You lucky people. Maybe I'll do some more during the week. Maybe I'll just take the rest of the week off. So until then, thanks for subscribing. Thanks for tuning in. Above all, stay safe, and we'll catch you on the flip side.